Hello one and all, and welcome back to the RimWorld Gun Empire series. Might I just say, my good friends, I am ever so glad to see you here today. I'm so glad that you're joining me once more for yet another episode. Though I do plan for this episode to be much shorter than the first episode, I still have a lot planned for us to do today. We still have a lot of work, of course. First and foremost, we're going to get started today by mining out several different coal ore veins from the sides of these mountains. Now, the reason that we're doing that is because we are actually going to begin selling some of this coal for components, which of course is very crucial for making firearms. Based on the comments from the first episode, it would seem the vast majority of you guys are okay with me selling things like coal and stuff like that, as long as I'm doing it to actually buy components and other resources that we need to make guns, so we could think of it less as buying and selling and more of just bartering one resource for another, I suppose. However, after Richard went back home to the base and Scott was still out mining that night, we ended up getting some monumental news. It would appear that Scott and Downs are now engaged. Looks like Richard told Downs that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, and she completely agreed. Well, apparently it is that easy. I'm very happy for them. In the meantime, of course, however, as Downs is waiting on her marriage to take place, I could really use her help in researching some basic vehicles. Now, this is going to allow us to build several different car parts to build some basic vehicles like a truck, a bike, things like that. Of course, though, I think we're going to end up going with the mule. It appears to be some type of flatbed truck, and honestly, I just think it is the perfect smuggling vehicle. I mean, take a look at it here. It's amazing. Now, as one might imagine, it is going to take Downs quite a bit of time to finish up the research that is required for basic vehicles. So, in the meantime, we're going to try to better our base, beautify it, and things like that with new flooring. A lot of you guys were letting me know in the last episode, of course, as well, that I shouldn't bother smoothing the floors and stuff. And I do agree with that. It's just the problem is when we were doing that originally in the last episode, we didn't have a lot of stone blocks just yet, unfortunately. So of course, now that we have a good stockpile of those, we're going to try to use those mainly for our flooring and whatnot. With that being said, sometime later, Downs finally ended up finishing the basic vehicles research, which means we can finally get started on our mule truck. And I am ever so excited, I must say. Now, unfortunately, it's not as simple as just building the vehicle out of steel and components. No, we actually have to build a garage bench, which unfortunately we don't have enough components for, so we're going to have to do a little bit of trading with the Marshal Service. Naturally, of course, we would send Scott out all by his lonesome on this trip. At some point, I would like to get him something like a guard, or just begin sending out other colonists along with him in case he were to get ambushed or something like that, but with all his charisma, he had finally made it to the Marshal Service and began trading our coal for components. Once that was completed, of course, he began making his way back home. Now, this trip is going to be much faster and much easier, of course, on Scott once we finally get the old mule up and running. Unfortunately, we weren't able to buy enough components to actually build the vehicle components on the garage bench. We had barely made enough to build the garage bench itself. But we did end up getting that completed, however. Now, I decided to check in on some of the components that we would need to build a vehicle itself, and the majority of them did take a decent bit of components. So we're going to end up having to do a bit more trading. I apologize. I know this episode is starting off quite slow with a lot of trading. We would sell anything and everything we could find, including a Gorlin seed that had sprouted just near the base, and we had quite a few other things in storage, some things that were left as gifts by visitors, and just basically anything else we had, really. Essentially anything that was worth a shiny little penny was loaded up into Scott's pockets and taken out of the territory with him all the way to the Marshal Service base once more. At some point, we're going to have to do some trading with the damn rebels, otherwise they may catch on and try to take us down. Plus, it would help out quite a bit seeing how the Marshal Service settlement here has to refresh their resources after a while. Regardless though, after a good bit of trading and traveling later, Scott had finally returned home and was unloading his inventory onto the shelves. He got a good bit of components as well as a good bit of fuel. Obviously, of course, components were extremely crucial to the car parts. I would say about 95% of the car parts that we built required components, but some of them also required the fuel, but mostly the fuel was used for gassing up the mule after we actually created it. It was at this point I was beginning to wonder if maybe I should have tried to save some resources, and instead of building a flatbed truck, maybe just build something like a dirt bike or something to try and smuggle these guns into these settlements, but oh well, it took a long time, but we finally got all the parts built, I suppose. And with that, of course, Scott and his amazing construction skill would finally finish up our mule truck. Now, as you can imagine, I'm getting sick of calling it the mule, so I was extremely relieved when I had the chance to name it. I decided to promptly rename our new and very first vehicle the Rifle Runner. Even though it's not very agile or very fast, it seemed like a fitting name. Oh, this bodacious bad boy sitting in the pale moonlight. It's going to be able to run so many guns across these deserty hills. I cannot wait. And if you thought building the truck was good news, get a load of this. Richard and Downs are beginning their marriage ceremony. Oh my, what joyous days we're having here at the Gun Empire. Ah yes, under these sandy, gigantic mountains, the two of them have decided to elope and join in a gorgeous union together. And of course, they've decided to party the night away, celebrating the glorious occasion. But now that that's finally over with, we can focus on what's truly important to us here, making some money. We're going to go out and do a bit of trading, but first we need to collect a lot of food. Even though the old Rifle Runner is going to get us to our locations a lot faster, we are still pretty low on rice and other plant material as well as meats. Thankfully though, hunting emu, ostriches, as well as several different boomalope would help us put a good bit of protein in our diet as well as our freezers. Now the only thing left for us to do is throw them down on the floor, butcher them like a bunch of savage animals, and begin turning them into jerky or sandwiches or something that Scott here can take on his trading missions and eat on the inside of the old Rifle Runner on his way there. I like to envision as well, since it still can take over a day or so for us to get there and come back, that he's most likely either sleeping in the bed of the truck or in the cab. I don't know, I think that's a nice little detail to add, very realistic. He of course immediately began heading out. I was actually quite surprised to see that he could drive over the barbed wire, but maybe we'll just pretend that they took it down and that it wouldn't have busted all four of his tires. He immediately began heading back to the Marshal Service for a little bit of trading. As you can see, of course, he is going quite fast as well, but unfortunately back home, we ended up having some impid scavengers attacking us from the Outlands. There appeared to be only 3 of them, though they were quite well armed. One of them was only carrying a silver axe, but the others had a large Anaconda revolver pistol and a sniper rifle. They've most likely heard rumor of a gun empire beginning in the desert here and thought that this were some small operations functioning out of tents or maybe some small buildings. Little do they know that we have a fortress of a mountain. I suppose though, with that being said, they're going to be finding out just how fortified we truly are in just a few moments as they're beginning their attack. Unfortunately, they have been here for hours planning out their attack because we don't have enough manpower to try and attack them directly. We're going to have to try to defend the base from our barricades and barbed wire. One of the foolish little rapscallions was trying to charge directly at us with his axe, and he ended up catching a bullet to the head a few times and dropped to the ground. The others, though, were continuing to fire at us, so we began trying to move to cover where they couldn't hit us. Shinichi went down, unfortunately, but Richard scooped him up into his arms and ran to cover where they were safe. At least for the moment, it would appear. Even as the two of them had taken cover though and were trying to hide, they were still experiencing heavy fire from the enemies. We would have to figure something out, and quick, but for now Shinichi is literally bleeding to death, so Richard is going to try to stop that bleeding by tending to his wounds even without medicine right here on the field. Even as we were still under heavy fire, Richard began tending to Shinichi up until the point that Shinichi was actually able to walk once more. However, unfortunately, this did not last very long. Shinichi was quickly struck by another bullet and hit the ground again. This time around though, Richard was out in the open, all by himself taking on the enemy. He would not give up though. If this has to be his last stand right here, right now in this spot, so be it. Richard is no longer a coward. He is not going to turn on his friends this time. And it's a good thing he didn't, because now the cavalry is here. That's right, Scott has arrived back home, and there's going to be some hell to pay. But first, Scott is going to distract the scavengers so Richard can carry Shinichi to safety. Damn, that was a close call. We're not going to be able to sustain too many more bullets hitting the old rifle runner though. It's going to be best if Scott kind of gets them off the trail of Richard here and he goes and parks it and starts fighting. Thankfully, it would appear that Richard has got Shinichi inside the base where Downs can begin tending to his wounds to ensure that he doesn't die. Richard is now running back onto the battlefield. Scott has also parked the truck and is running inside our walls where he can meet up with Richard to provide cover fire. The two of them, of course, would immediately begin engaging in a firefight with the two remaining scavengers that were still alive. Luckily, they both seemed to be quite injured, so even if we were to wait them out, they would die, but we decided to take matters into our own hands. Scott began moving into position alongside Richard. The two of them ended up killing another of the impids while downing him, and then the last remaining one with the anaconda pistol decided to flee. We would also begin retreating just a little bit to ensure as she was fleeing that she wouldn't get a lucky shot in at us, and after she was gone, we decided to come in and begin putting out some fires. But before we did that, we had an impid to strip and then, of course, stabbed to death here on the ground. Once Scott was finally finished taking out all of his rage on this filthy impid scavenger, then we could begin putting out some fires and trying to haul all of the equipment that they dropped back into our base. Oh, and let me tell you, this has been a very exhausting night, exhausting battle, so I'm very glad that we all get to lie our weary heads down and rest with everyone intact. Nobody died, we were a little bit injured, but nobody's dead. Truthfully though, I don't think that would be the case if Scott and Hatton came in when he did and saved us. Some time later though, I realized we didn't exactly have any way to easily access the inside of the base when we're actually driving our vehicle, so we began mining out a small section of the hill here. That way we can put an automatic garage door in. That way we can bring the mule in anytime we like without having to get out. Obviously, of course, it wasn't very ideal for us to have to go around to the one side of the base where the opening was large enough for the vehicle, especially driving over the barbed wire, and this will help us from having to be exposed to enemies if, say for example, just like Scott was earlier, they were nearby, he was having to get out of the vehicle and run inside. After bringing the rifle runner in, it was time for us to unload our cargo. We had a bunch of silver, a good bit of components, and a good bit of chem fuel as well. We were going to haul all that inside, and now all we really needed to get started with our gun production was plenty of steel. So of course we immediately began mining out several veins of steel that we could find within the mountains. At some point though, we're going to have to start going to different places, maybe setting up some camps and whatnot to try and retrieve components and steel. First though, before we end up doing something like that, I think I'd like to increase our population. Now I do also want to mention I have added a new mod to the series. By your all's recommendation, it would seem a lot of you have said that I should add one of the mods that actually increase the price of weapon cells, so I've decided to add the full gun sell price mod. Now this mod, basically what I assume here, of course, based on the name, is that weapons are going to sell for their full price, which does end up making sense to me, of course. I think I would like to have something where I could make it sell for a little bit less, and then as we establish credibility, we sell them full price, but I'm a bit too lazy. I'm not gonna lie to you. I didn't find any mod that would allow me to do that, though I didn't look too hard, so I'm gonna go with this one. I hope that's okay. And with that being said, it is finally time for us to begin working on some firearms. Yes, we are finally going to be making some guns here in the Gun Empire. Not necessarily guns, they are weapons, of course. We're actually going to be making some incendiary launchers. We may end up making a few anaconda pistols as well to sell though. Now, of course, you may be curious why I am making the incendiary launchers first. Those actually have a very high sell price. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it is 380 silver, which is one of the highest prices for the types of guns and whatnot that we can make currently. So obviously, of course, whatever gets us the largest and fastest profit, we are going to go that route. We will end up doing some research at some point, I believe, on different types of weapons, but for the time being, we are actually going to have Scott here do a bit of mining under the base. Well, under the mountain, which actually is our base. For the time being here, I actually have 2 small storage rooms planned out, as well as 6 small prison cells. As one might imagine, this project is very large and tedious, especially for Scott alone, so once Richard has completed his tasks of creating weapons, or once he runs out of resources, we're also going to get him to help out as well. In the meantime as well, I'm going to have Downs begin researching into blowback operations, which will end up unlocking several different types of weapons. Now, there are other different research trees as well that will end up going down at some point that do the same thing. The same thing in theory, of course, as it will unlock many different types of of weapons per research branch. And now, my dear friends, as you can see, it would appear that Richard has run out of components to continue building weapons and is now helping Scott with all the mining here on the new section of the base. Normally, I would be pretty excited that he's able to help out and that this isn't going to take near as long. Richard doesn't have a crazy high mining skill, but he has one that's high enough that, you know, this project will go a bit faster with his help. But with that being said, we're also out of components again, meaning we're going to have to go back out on a trade mission at some point. Now, I know I have mentioned several times that I am actually going to begin trying to trade with the rebels just as often as I do the martial service. Truthfully, we don't give a shit about either side of the war as long as we are making a good profit. This would be a good time to do so, I believe, as well as the marshals, or at least the settlement that is nearby to us under the martial service, is running very low on components and other resources. So we may end up basically just trading with the rebels to give the martial service time to refresh. At some point throughout this episode, I would also like to try and begin building at least some dirt path to both of those settlements. But of course, with that being said, we've done a good bit of work in the base under the mountain here. It's time for us to load up a bunch of stuff to take off to one of the rebel settlements to do a bit of trading with Scott here. So of course, he loaded up the old rifle runner and headed on out. The journey, of course, was long and treacherous. Actually, it was neither of those things because this truck is really awesome and keeps us safe for the most part, so it's not really a big deal. But while Scott's doing a bit of trading, I wanted to mention something here that's not really too big or important per se, but I still wanted to mention it nonetheless. I'm actually going to be changing the faction type of the Oak Foundation, which is basically the secretive branch of the rebel forces. No particular reason other than it was just interfering with gameplay and stuff like that and causing me a few issues. For you as the viewer, there really won't be any change at all except for this new icon, as you can see. It's the exact same faction, leader, gear, stuff like that. The only difference is it has went from the Savage Settler icon, I believe, to the Rough Outlander icon. So I mean, none of that really has anything story-wise, any implications, but I just want to mention it in case you were wondering why it changed. In other news, however, it was time for Scott to head all the way back home after trading with the rebel forces. Now, if you have a keen eye, just as Scott, you may notice this small mining operation in the desert hills not too far from our base. Well, my good friends, you just as well as Scott are correct. It would appear that we do indeed have some mining operations going on here in these mountains by the Thromboian Union. Funny enough, looks like they're mining components, just what we were hoping for. I decided that I would give our people some time to kind of rest and recuperate and kind of just get their stuff in order before we decide to go out and attack that mining work site. I'm sure, as you guys know from the first episode, when we had the raid from the Thromboian Union, they are nothing to mess with. They actually wear some pretty good armored, well, armor for lack of a better term, and have some very tough weaponry. So they're not exactly anything to just laugh at right away, so we do need to prepare for this ahead of time. I ended up having Scott build us a gun complex, that way we could uninstall it and haul it in the truck for when we get there. We do have some better, more fortified turrets, but unfortunately we can't uninstall them, so this is the best we can do. We loaded everything up into the truck and then set out once again. This time around it was actually quite a bit slower getting there, and it was a bit of a rougher drive as we're going through these small hills, but eventually we did make it. After arriving, I realized the terrain here was extremely green and shitty, and if we were to stay here for too long, our lungs would fill up with toxic gas, no doubt, from all the pollution in the nearby area. Lucky enough for us, though, I suppose we won't be staying too long, as we're going to kill all these Thromboians, take their components, and then get the hell out of Dodge. Actually, you know what? Take their components and take their very expensive ancient weapons as well, and then get the hell out of Dodge. Regardless, though, we began getting everything into position. We would actually end up having Downs drive the vehicle, because I realized at some point during my testing with the vehicles, you can actually injure other pawns with them. So even though she's incapable of violence, she can still run somebody over, which is pretty cool. So in other words, if we mow them down with our gun complex, there's a very good chance that Downs is going to come by and run over their heads. Alright, look, I'm going to level with you. There is more than a good chance I do end up doing that. As you can see, as the battle starts here, I actually damn near immediately bring Downs in with the rifle runner and just start trying to run over all these pawns. If nothing else, this is completely distracting them from fighting with us, giving us a good chance to shoot at them, but also occasionally running them over and hurting them and or killing them. And as you can see, this was extremely effective for the most part, and I would continue continue doing this up until the point that the truck was actually very damaged, but also ended up running out of fuel. Part of that, of course, is because our fuel tank was damaged though. However, with the rifle runner out of commission and Downs hiding on the inside, the fight was still yet to be over, as we were still killing as many as possible up until the point they began to flee. And now with that, just like a flash of lightning, the battle was over. We had one remaining Thromboian who was able to walk at least, and they ended up running away unfortunately. Though we did try to kill them, it did not work. However, there was one injured remaining Thromboian just underneath the rifle runner. We decided that we would actually try to tend to them and keep them from dying, as I felt that they needed a new home in the gun empire, if you know what I mean. Speaking of which, I can't wait to rehome these nice components as well back at the good old gun empire. Based on the surrounding area, as well as the contents of this building, it would appear that they may have been excavating the mountains as well as any ancient structures nearby, looking for ancient mechanoids. I suppose we'll end up taking those with us as well. As you might imagine though, we're not going to get very far at all without our truck, and we're definitely not going to be leaving it behind. The issue is with the truck, it is extremely damaged from the battle. Now the majority of the damage I'll say is probably from bow and arrow shots, a few stray bullets, things like that, as the components of the truck are essentially demolished for the most part. However, it is also most likely due to us running over several Thromboians. I will say though, I struggled quite a bit with actually getting the truck repaired, because for whatever reason, the colonists wanted to repair it 1 second and then run away, so they basically just kept taking turns. Eventually though, after a very long amount of time taking to repair the truck, it was finally operational once again, and we used a teeny tiny bit of fuel that we had left to gas it up, and we arrived back home. One of the very first things we did after arriving home was throw our new Thromboian companion into his home sweet home of a prison cell, where we would begin enslaving him, of course. We also promptly stripped him of his armor. I'm sure that's worth a pretty penny to somebody. And now finally and thankfully, with all the components that we pried from the cold dead hands of those Thromboians we murdered, we are finally able to create more weapons that we can sell. Truly a joyous day, I must say. At some point though, of course, as we do more research for different types of guns and whatnot, I really hope to ramp up production, and of course after we grow population and have more people with good smithing and crafting skills. For the time though, we're going to be working with what we have, which of course includes scrounging up some steel by shredding some mechanoid corpses any chance we have, as well as hunting down some local wild dromedaries. You know, this just reminds me, I want to take a second and say that I'm very grateful that we're actually using vanilla vehicles, because although I do like pack animals like dromedaries and stuff like that, this is so much easier not having to try and tame them or take care of them, feed them, stuff like that. The truck requires very little maintenance. It was around about this time as well, I decided that we would start beautifying this new section of our base where our new storage areas are, as well as our prison cells, because of course working on the prison cells and improving those is going to help us recruit and enslave any pawns that we put in there. But of course, as I say that, we did manage to enslave our new Thromboian companion here with a very shitty prison cell, but as you can see, he is now indeed enslaved and has a pretty decent skill set, especially with mining and construction. He is also an undergrounder, which is very useful given the current environment that we live in. And boy howdy, just let me tell you that construction skill immediately came in handy. He's also wearing one of the suits that we had in storage. I really don't know why, but to be honest with you, I don't think we have any other apparel or attire for him, so we'll allow it for now. But we also did end up making him a slave collar to ensure that he is properly suppressed and won't try to rebel anytime soon. We finally started moving many of our shelves into our storage areas, which was basically the entire purpose of having a storage area, of course, and we also kind of started working to try and finish up a lot of the flooring in these cells, but we ended up running out of stone blocks, so it looks like this project's going to be on a little bit of a hiatus for the time being. Interestingly enough though, sometime later we ended up having a combat supplier from the United Rebel Forces that had entered the area and were looking to do a bit of trading with us. It was your basic standard Rebel trade caravan, a few drones, a bunch of soldiers in camo, though I must mention that their camo is not desert camo, so I'm assuming this is a traveling caravan that primarily does trading, probably sees very little battles, because it would appear that they are maybe from an arid shrubland or possibly a a temperate forest settlement. Regardless though, there appeared to be a very familiar face among the soldiers of the rebel caravan, a purple, handsome, Thromboian-looking gentleman carrying a rifle some of us may find familiar. Okay, yeah, I said the word familiar like 6 times there, but it's true, he is very familiar, of course. Anyhow though, we ended up doing a bit of trading with the caravan and sold them some of the weapons that we had created. Unfortunately though, it would appear that we are most likely one of the first stops for this trade caravan, as they didn't have all that much silver to actually buy things from us, meaning of course that we can't sell them the Thromboian swords or hammer that we got when we attacked the mining work site, which was extremely unfortunate because they are worth a lot of money. So it looks like we're most likely going to have to travel to a large city or settlement or something of that nature to sell this, somewhere that they will actually have enough money to accommodate the items. Because it will definitely be a very good payday for us, for sure. Some time later though, I noticed that the rebel trade caravan was beginning to leave. They actually ended up going through our doors and walls and traveling through our territory here, which we really don't mind. They were beginning to leave through the northern section of the map when, unfortunately, we had some visitors from the RimWorld Marshal Service arrive. The two groups of soldiers immediately began slaughtering one another. Unfortunately for the RimWorld Marshal Service soldiers, though, they were highly outnumbered. And the rebels ended up killing 2 of the 3 soldiers that had arrived, with one of them easily escaping as soon as they had entered. They basically left. But this does mean that we actually have quite a few weapons lying on the ground here. Most of them of poor or normal quality, but some of them actually with masterwork as well as a legendary knife, which is pretty insane. So of course we had Scott and Richard swoop in and begin grabbing up all these weapons to take back home. Some of them we would use for us, and others of course we would keep in storage. The ones that we ended up keeping for our soldiers here, or I should say giving to our soldiers here, were mostly rifles, except for a Glock pistol that we actually gave to Shinichi here. I ended up giving Richard the assault rifle style rifle, of course, and I ended up giving Scott a more desert tech sniper rifle to replace the survival rifle that he had been using for quite a bit of time there. Now, of course, I could end up selling these weapons, and I'm sure we most likely will at some point if we are able to get better weapons for our people here just, later on down the line. But for now, this is what we're going to be doing. It sure beats the hell out of those makeshift weapons that we're using, even though Shinichi is dual wielding one of those, you know what I mean. For a gun empire, there is something of a severe lack of weapons, or at least there was a severe lack of weapons in our storage. Currently, we have plenty of makeshift weapons and Thromboian ancient weapons like a bow and swords and things like that, but very little actual guns that we'll be selling. It is, of course, very possible, though, if we have a trade caravan from the Outlands at some point in the near future, we will trade them our makeshift weapons, as they basically take anything they can get their hands on. In the meantime, however, I've decided to have Richard try his hand at making some metal armor, which is actually worth a lot of money, and if it begins turning out fairly well, we may also end up selling that to both sides of the war, as well as other factions, basically, of course, anyone that's willing to buy it. But for this first set of armor, I've decided to give it to Shinichi. Not only are we actually making him his very own set of metal armor that he'll be wearing, but we've also decided to give him Richard's ballistic shield from the first episode that we created. I do realize that it may seem a little bit strange for me to just give away the ballistic shield, especially so quickly since Richard has only had it for a very short period of time, but within that amount of time I've realized that Richard will not really be using that in any actual situation, as he never has a one-handed weapon. While Shinichi here, you'll notice, has his Glock pistol that goes right along with it, and of course if he wants to put the shield away, he can actually dual wield his makeshift machine gun along with his pistol once again. I see Shinichi becoming something of an enforcer here for the gun empire, but let me know what you guys think about that. Should he have his own kind of task squad, his own mercenaries or something like that at some point? A little bit of time later, we ended up having a group of travelers from the RimWorld Marshal Service once again that were passing by. Now, these folks weren't exactly passing by, nor were they just visitors. No, these two people, my friends, are RimWorld Marshal Service soldiers, but they are not like any other soldiers. These are actually of the specialist class. The best way that I can think to explain the specialist among the RimWorld Marshal Service is maybe like the Juggernaut from the Call of Duty series, but also kind of like a detective in some situations. My best guess is that the Marshal Service has decided to send them here after their group of soldiers was attacked by the rebel caravan. They're most likely investigating the situation, and they're most likely going to have quite a few questions with us. But while our protagonists of the story are being investigated by the basically CIA equivalent in this universe of the Marshal Service, it is time for me to bid you all farewell, my friends. I hope you have enjoyed today's episode. I want to thank you guys ever so much for watching, of course. I want to thank you guys as well for all of the support. I know a lot of you guys, longtime members of the channel, really like the RKRU extended kind of universe I have here, and you guys always enjoy these types of series, but the first episode, the turnout on that episode is amazing. You know, I mean, I haven't had a video do that well in this universe that fast, I don't think, since the very first episode of the Logging Empire, which of course is the very first series. So, you know, I'm just really ecstatic about the tremendous amounts of support and hype and everything that everyone seems to have for this series. But once again, of course, I love you guys ever so much. Thank you once again so much for your support on the episodes, on the series, and just thank you for watching. I love you guys. I will see you next time. Goodbye.